Welcome everyone to our first live case study for the Advanced Elementor Facebook group. I've got Chris Castillo here of the famous Supercharge Your Agency Facebook group. He has been a contributor on the Advanced Elementor group a number of times, and he has an incredible group of people over at his agency, and frankly, tons of great things that you can take a look at on that site. Specifically, I think I pointed out just the other day, the performance video that you did with Kyle on Cloudways it's practically a reference that I point people to now to understand how you kind of progressively take care of performance. It's fantastic stuff. And today he's here to show us how to do some pretty interesting and unique things with Elementor, especially when you get to the place where it doesn't quite fit the bill and you want to go beyond what it may be capable of. So with that, Chris, I'd like to hand it over to you. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it, man. And I honestly, I'm looking forward to this because I know I get a lot of people ask me about, how do I do this and how do I do that, and people don't really quite know, because I think they're accustomed to the Elementor interface and they know that there are some limitations and they don't know how I bend those limitations, right? And really, at the end of the day, like 9 out of 10 times, the answer is just some custom CSS, right? And so I just wanted to kind of show people, one is how is my setup, like how I've set up my projects so that I can easily inject, my custom CSS wherever I want, and then how I go about determining when I'm going to need custom CSS and when I'm not going to need custom CSS. Most of the time I try to opt to do things within Elementor and only do the custom stuff when it's absolutely necessary. Especially when you're looking for, and you just mentioned the performance, I'll touch on this real quickly, but when you're considering performance, with Elementor, if you style one thing one way, and then you're going to have that same thing used multiple times across the website, well, Elementor, because it's a tool and it's made to be user-friendly, isn't always the most efficient at doing those things. And what it'll do is create CSS for every single one of those blocks throughout the whole site. And what you can do in terms of improving the performance of the website is to just throw some of this CSS that is going to be used across the entire website, just throw it into your style sheet, and I'll show you how to do that. And it just makes things run a little bit smoother. But the main focus of this video is just going to be to show you how to bend the rules of Elementor a little bit to do a little bit more with it. So what we're looking at here is a website that I built for a photographer here in Toronto. And this is obviously not the actual website. This is just a mock setup that I imported into a local WordPress installation so I can show you guys how I went about creating this. And the main thing that I wanted to show is a couple of things, really, is these little content buckets here, these little call to actions, which are really nice and pretty neat here. And how I got them to look this way, and how I got this little more button on the corner here, and a few other little things there having to do with these buckets. The second thing being this little kind of scattered arrangement of images and copy. It's something that it's not very easy to do with Elementor, and I'm sure there may actually be a way to do this. There might be some people that are really good with manipulating the Elementor interface where they might be able to do this. I personally wasn't able to find a good solution to this, and I'll show you the reason why, because I'm going to, in a moment, just scale this around so you can see how this actually behaves. And so for me, this was one of these situations where I knew I had to do some custom CSS to get this to work exactly the way I wanted it to. So if I just go into like responsive mode, let me just pull this aside here. I'll show you what I meant by the way that this moves around a little bit. So if we scale this screen down, you'll see that these pictures will scale down, but eventually they get to the point where they stop scaling down and they just kind of stay static. And you'll see here that they don't scale down any further. And what happens is they actually just stay in one spot, and they get anchored basically to like the left, or on this here in this section, it gets anchored to the right edge, and on the flower photo it gets anchored to this left edge. and it just kind of allows the copy to stay in as like a priority and focus, and not have the picture like dominate the section. And if we scale it down really far, you'll see that it kind of retains that positioning until eventually it gets to a point where it'll kind of snap into place, and you get this nice arrangement of photo, copy, photo, copy. And so to get that to work, and to really have all like the really smooth transition from, you know, every single dimension of screen type of thing, the full responsiveness is not something that I found was very easy to do with Elementor. And so I'll show you how I went about doing that basically. And that's really what I think we're going to be covering in this video. And I know, Mike, you wanted to get a look into how my Sass setup is and everything, right? You use Sass in your setups?
So I do outside of WordPress because I haven't found a good workflow in particular. Well, I should say outside of WordPress with Elementor.
Oh,
I do cool. Using in a completely different theme and a completely different approach for bigger companies. But for WordPress with Elementor, I do not, because I haven't found a good really encyclopedia or mapping to the Elementor style sheet, frankly.
So let me show you really quickly what this sort of looks like, because I think a lot of people really might be curious about this. If I go, let me just open up my project work folder here.
Now you're using Sass, and you're also so you've got a build process, obviously.
Yeah.
Are you going to kind of go through the tools that you use here? Obviously, using Gulp or Grunt.
Yeah. So this is all. It's basically a Gulp Sas Workflow, is the way I describe it to everybody. And basically, we have this basic folder structure, right? You have like your assets, your CSS, and your JS. Your assets is actually like the development assets. They're not production. The production assets are in the CSS and JS folder. So there's like the final CSS goes in here. This is like the minified, compressed version or whatever, with all the prefixes and all that stuff that you would need. And then this is the finalized JavaScript file. And we're not going to be talking about JavaScript in this because it's beyond what I think we can cover in this timeline. But and then basically there's this file called a Gulp file. And for those who don't know what Gulp is, it's basically a task automation system. And what it does is it lets you create these little tasks that you can run automatically, and you can even have them run in sequence, like do this and then do this. And what it'll do is it'll run a particular set of tasks. Once that task is complete, it'll get the results of that task and it'll feed it into another process. And so you can have this sort of like cascading effect of running things through all these different processes. And an example of that would be like getting like a Sass file, which is one of the things I'm going to show you, converting that into CSS. That would be one task. And then, you know, you'd get the CSS that comes out of that task. You want to funnel that into another task that all it does is it minifies that CSS. So it takes out all the extra lines, all the spacing, all the comments. And so you funnel one thing into the next task, and it does this automatically just by running a simple command called a Gulp command. And so I'll show you what, if I go into, this is my, I use Visual Studio Code. And if I just expand this here, I'll show you my Gulp file here. And basically I have a few things that go in here. I'm not going to explain them in too much detail because I think it's going to take a little bit too much time. But essentially you have a bunch of different tasks here. Like these are the labels. So I have a task called Watch, one called Styles, and one called Scripts. And so if I run a command Gulp without any name for a task, it runs this default task, which basically just says, if you just run Gulp, then just automatically run these two tasks in order. So Scripts and then Styles. If you specify a specific task like Gulp Scripts, for example, it will only run the task that's defined in here. And so this is basically my Gulp file. It's very, 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 very simple. I actually have a little bit more elaborate version of this where it does a little bit more stuff. But for this is perfect for what we need right now. And the main thing here is to notice that the main thing that I work with regards to like a WordPress project is this Gulp styles task here, which basically gets my Sass code and it just converts it into CSS, and basically it will move it into this CSS folder. So what it'll look into this assets under CSS or SCSS, and it'll look for this file called styles.scss, and it will run all this the Sass that's in here and compile it into a finished style sheet here. And the only thing that I've done in order to get this to work with WordPress essentially is just to enqueue in my child theme this final styles, the compiled style sheet, right? This becomes my child theme style sheet. And so in my functions file here, I just WP enqueue the style. And then basically what happens is every time that I run the gulp styles command, it will compile all my my Sass into this CSS file, and because it's already enqueued, it'll automatically just load it on the front end. So actually, right now, if this is the final product, that's what we're going to be working towards. And if you look at the style sheet right now that we're working with here, I've actually commented out everything, and I just ran this Gulp styles task. So it's compiled all the code, meaning that it's basically stripped out all these comments, so none of this styling is going to get applied. And if I reload this, you'll see what we're going to start with here. So this is basically like native Elementor. This is about as far as I was willing to go with the native Elementor styling and options and stuff like that.
Hey, you mind if I throw you off just a little bit here and ask, could you actually edit with Elementor just so people can see what this is? I think that'd be...
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so
at a very simple level, you have a basic Gulp process or task that will actually essentially create the combined style sheet. I'm not sure. I know one of the things with Sass that I do is I componentize my CSS, right, and split them into different files. But it actually, when I compile it into CSS, it becomes one minified file.
Right, exactly, on a single line.
It allows me to kind of separate things and not have a gigantic styles.css for my child theme or something like that.
Right.
And creating that performance problem of having 15 different CSS files gives you one minified before it even sees WordPress.
Exactly. And I do exactly the same thing. What I do is I have a folder structure where I'll put in all of my CSS for specific components. Like if I'm going to have forms, well, a form is not specific to a page. It's going to get used across the whole website. So I'll have a specific file just for forms or a specific file for typography. But if there's specific styles that are only going to be used on a specific page, then I create these pages style sheets. And that's where only page-specific CSS goes. And if there are stylings that are going to be used across multiple pages, maybe not the entire site, and it's not necessarily a specific component like a button, right? Like you talk about, like, I don't know if there's like this whole atomic model of like CSS, right? It's just like I'm not going to remember the exact breakdown, but they distinguish between molecules, I think, molecules, atoms, and I don't remember what the other one was. But basically, at the most fundamental element is something like a button or something, right? And then where you have like molecules would be like, let's say, a call to action that has that button in it, but also has something else, and that call to action is going to be used across multiple areas. So I would have components, and then you might end up having like widgets as another folder or something where you have those components, but then you're building more complex objects out of those in that file. But for the pages, if there's just not really a molecule, let's say, like a widget, or it's just something else, then I drop it into the shared SCSS file, and this is where multiple pages will share certain styling, right? And so that's kind of how I structure my projects like this, right? So what we're working with right now is just this photography page, because it's just kind of like what I've set up so far. And this is where we're going to pop in all of the the styles. Now, one thing that I think is another good thing to mention, and I might be jumping the gun here a little bit, but there is another task called Gulp Watch. One of the things that's really cool about this is that when you run this Gulp Watch task, there's a little tool in the Gulp file called Browser Sync. And what Browser Sync is basically a little tool that will automatically, I think this is photography. Yeah. So it's a little tool that when you make a change, what it's doing right now is actually watching all of my files for me. And if I make a change and I save this file, this little tool, this watcher, is going to automatically know that I've changed something, and it's going to then automatically reload my browser here, so I can see the changes pretty much instantaneously. So I'll probably show that while we're working on this little project here. But that's kind of the way that my projects are set up. Is I have my SCSS folders and files, and this style.scss file is like the master Sass file, and that's where all we're doing in this file really is just controlling which components are we going to be using in this style sheet. Are we going to be using this buttons? Are we going to be using the footer? And if we are, all we're doing is we're just calling them into this style sheet by importing them. And you'll notice that I've commented out all these things because we're not using those right now. I could pretty much comment out all of this stuff too. The only thing that we would really need is this photography import, because we're going to be pulling in all of the Sass code from this one file, right? So that's the setup here. And basically what I have here in terms of Elementor here is I got a section with a 2-column section here, and it's just, a heading and some text. And here is just a spacer, and then the background image here is just this image of the parents holding the child's hand. Down here we have another section here, and this section is just pulled up using a negative margin. So this would normally just look like that, right? And it's a 3-column section here, and these are all just call to action widgets. And these call to action widgets, I use these extensively pretty much on almost every project that I work on, because they're really, really versatile. And you'll see just from this one example. So this call to action widget here, if we look at the content, it looks like it's like this 2-column thing, but it's really just a sneaky little trick, because all I've done is really just loaded a background in here that is already, let me just see if I can show you this here. So it already has that background there, right? It's so that's just part of the background image. It's not actually in the structure really, right? And then all I've done then is for the content here, that's the background image, and then I've put in the title, and I'll touch on this in a second. And for the button text, I've put in more, and I've done a bit of style into this button. I'll show you what that looks like, but that's pretty much all it is. It's just the heading and the button. The description here, which is normally used to put in, some creative description, would go like that, right? But what I've done is, because the design that I wanted is to have this kind of like a underlined, an underline under each of these headings. So again, you can't add structure to Elementor. That's one of the limitations of it, right? Like you can't just inject. Well, you can. It's exactly what I've done. So you can't, because you can. There is no like way of styling this heading the way that I wanted it to. I've just added in here a very basic HTML element, which is a horizontal ruler, I think it's what it's called, but horizontal line is basically all it is. And I've attached a little CSS class to it, because that's what we're going to hook to in the CSS to be able to style it the way we want. And because this same horizontal line is going to be used across these 3 elements, that's going to make it's going to give us the ability to style all of this in just probably 1 or 2 lines of code, right? So that's what all of these really look like. One of the things that was a limitation of Elementor, which I needed to use CSS for is I can't move this button position down to this corner where I want it to. If you go into like the styling here and go into button, there's no positioning options here, right? It just floats wherever. The only type of positioning you could do is by changing like the spacing between the heading and the description and stuff. You can't really do anything else aside from that.
Yeah, even with the new Elementor options to move things around and fix, it still doesn't address this because it's one cohesive widget. It doesn't necessarily see all the components within. Right.
The positioning is for the entire widget, not for the elements within the widget, right? Yep. So that was the limitation. So essentially what I did was I just set these up this way with the content, with this horizontal line in the description. And the other limitation, let me just show you in a preview here what the other limitation was here is I didn't want these to stretch out this wide. I found it didn't look very good. So I wanted these to be, to only stretch out to a certain width. Past a certain width, I wanted them to just align themselves in a nice and neat kind of fashion. Again, this is not really something you can do. Well, actually, we were talking about this before we started this. This wasn't something that you could do before with Elementor when I first created this page. It is something you might be able to do now, and I haven't tried this, but with the custom positioning under the width section, you can actually select a width here and specify a width. But the problem with this is that the actual option I was looking for was not a specific width. It was a maximum width, and that was what I was looking for. And you can't do that with Elementor right now. Like you can say that this is going to be if we set this at like 468 or 450 pixels. Well, if I really wanted this to be like 480 pixels, you could probably put it in here, but I think it just doesn't really work out too well. Like let me just try doing this really quickly and we'll see what this looks like. Cause I'm kind of curious myself. If I do 450 pixels across all of these and we just update this, my guess is that they're all going to be left aligned. Yeah. So they're all going to be left aligned and they're not centered within the space. So that's one of the things, the situations that I guess you could probably go into this column and maybe center this. So that might be a way of doing it. So I think this actually would replicate what I've done in CSS fairly decently, I think. Now, the only problem that I see here, though, is that, excuse me, this should pop into the center now. So this is more or less what we were starting to work with. So there's a couple limitations to this. One is you still don't address the button. And two is this horizontal align center, there is no responsive options for it. So if in the tablet or mobile display you wanted a different alignment, you may not be able to accomplish that. So just my thoughts off top of my head, but that's we'll proceed as if these options weren't available, because they weren't when we when I initially produced this design. So let me just go back to default and let me just reset this to default. So that's the first thing. Okay, so this is actually pretty straightforward. So I think we'll probably just tackle this really quickly in the CSS file right now. And we'll probably spend more time on this because this actually takes quite a bit more effort than this does. So, and also just to note too, is that all these hover effects, these are all just basic parts of Elementor. I mean, it's just on a hover effect, you have a filter blur that happens, and then it just has like a overlay that goes a little bit darker. Nothing you can do through Elementor. So if we pop into the Sass file here now, this is the first section here. So let me just see if I can maybe make this a little bit easier to read here. So the first thing is, this is the horizontal line that I added underneath every title. So that's what's going to take care of that here. I'll show that in a second. But if we look at the the first thing here is this home subnav call to action. That's basically each of these. Let me go back here. That's each of these call to actions here have the class home subnav call to action added to them, and you can see that here is the class here for this entire. That basically wraps the entire widget, right? And then if we go into, so basically what this is going to do here is we're just setting that max width property, and then we're just setting the margin here. This is a little margin trick that will basically center align the object. So it's saying you want the margin, the first value here is top and bottom. You're saying you want no top and bottom margins, and then you want the left and right margins to be automatically calculated so that it's always in the center. So if we just save that, and I just run gulp, and actually probably just, actually let's just gulp it. And I reload that here.
And we should point out that everything you're doing so far is not Sass, right? This so far is just plain old CSS.
Yeah, I mean I think that's one misconception that people have is that like Sass is like completely different than CSS. It literally is just CSS, but it just has extra features that you can use. Like for example, this next thing that we're going to do here is going to affect this class here. But if you see here, what we're doing here is we're nesting this class within this class, and what that does is it says, it's basically going to create a selector like this. So you're saying home subnav call to action, and then by nesting it, you're saying this class is like a child object of this element. So it's going to create a selector that's like this. So instead of writing it out like this, you just nest it underneath here, and you don't have to rewrite home subnav call to action every single time that you need to reference it. All you need to do is just kind of pop it within the curly braces, and it just automatically will create those selectors for you.
Yep. So the nesting is something that is specific to Sass that allows you to not have to. It allows you to be more dry, right? Do not repeat yourself.
Right. Exactly.
Even though the CSS itself does repeat itself. You're able to work in a more refined way.
Right, exactly. And so the other thing here is this Elementor call to action button wrapper. If we look at, let me go back into here, this call to action. So I think this is actually, where did I get that button? Elementor. Oh, so this is actually an Elementor class. So if we look at this call to action, let me just pop over the dev tools here.
Mm-hmm.
This is the content. This is the entire, oops. So this is the call to action widget. This is the entire big element, right? You'll see that class that we applied to it here. And then you have all these extra like elements that make up this entire widget, right? And if you look here, is that Elementor call to action button wrapper. And that's the class that we're targeting here. It's basically a wrapper class that wraps this button. So if you look, let me just make this a little bit.
Just for people who may not necessarily know what you're talking about there, that is actually something from Elementor that Elementor creates. It's not something you put in or created. It's the way that Elementor helps to style its own widgets.
Right.
And you're just basically using a little bit of detective work to figure out how you can now attach your CSS to their classes or kind of their structure.
Right. That's exactly it. This is already automatic. This is the output that Elementor creates, right? And all we're trying to do is figure out, okay, well, if this is how this widget is structured, we have this container here that has this button inside of it. So why don't we, find this container by looking for this class, and then start, adding some custom CSS to make this look and behave the way that we want it to, right? So if we look at what we've done here, essentially what we said is this wrapper, we've given this position of absolute. We've made it display inline block. So I think it's probably going to be a little bit too much to explain what each and every one of these things do. But basically what this is doing is we're saying, this here is, you'll see how everything kind of fits into like these rows, right? you have this row here for the heading, and then you have this other horizontal line that we put in here, and then we have the row for this button. We're basically saying, take the position absolute is going to take this out of its normal flow, and it's going to allow us to position it anywhere we want. And that's what we really want, is we want to be able to say, okay, don't put this into this widget, right after wherever it appears in the structure. I want to take it out of that structure, and I'm going to tell you exactly where I want it within this particular element, right? And so if we do that here, let me just save this and gulp it. And you'll see now that this is going to bring this down here. And I'll show you very quickly how that actually worked out. Okay, so if we just look at this button here, this is the wrapper, right? So what we did is we said, take this. If we take away the position absolute, you see it pops back into place. We've set position absolute, so it takes it out of its normal kind of flow. And we said, we want to position this in the bottom and at the right of this widget. And it knows, because what it's going to do is going to look up the chain of elements here, and it's going to find this this element here. I don't know if it's this element or if it's the widget, but it's probably one of these two. And it's basically positioning it according to the space that the parent object is really occupying. And so because it's kind of contained within this element here, it's positioning at the bottom right of this element here. And so that's why it's popped into this bottom corner here.
And so to figure this out, you actually had to throw together a CTA and then dig into the developer tools and figure out the structure and the classes that you needed to attach your CSS to. Right? Yeah,
actually, honestly, this is really, and maybe this might help people too, is like, if I just refresh this, so this, I just remove the changes, right? This is literally what I do when I go to do my custom CSS. I find this easier, is I just find the element that I want, and I just go in here in DevTools, and you'll see here it says element.style. This is basically applying the styles to, and it'll overwrite anything that's in any other style sheet. So whatever you put in here, it's going to affect the element. And I just start doing things like, okay, like what happens if I go position absolute? Okay, cool. So it took it out of its normal flow, but it's overlapping this thing. So can I move this like around, and I'll start playing around with some of these variables to figure out exactly where I want to get things, right? And if you'll see here, I've said that I want this to go to the right, but it actually hasn't. If you just hover over that, you'll see that the blue highlighted area there is the width of this element. So it already is to the right. It's just that it's the full width of that container. So that's why it's not moving over to the right, which is why like we have to get this to not be that wide, not the full length. And that's where the whole display inline block comes in place. So display inline block and the width auto, I think. There you go. So it's basically going to just say, like, just the width auto is just saying like only be as wide as you need to be. And that's basically the width of this button. And so by applying these to the object, now I know, okay, this is exactly what I want it to look like. And I can just get these styles now, create the CSS selector in here, and apply the same styles in here. And once I do that, and I gulp it, and I refresh it, and then now you'll see the changes get applied to everything. That's more or less like the workflow that I go through when I'm doing almost any custom CSS. To work out of like a code editor, you could still do it that way. And in fact, browser sync makes it a lot easier to do that, because it's basically almost like working out of the dev console. But I still, for the most part, prefer to just work in the dev console. That's just my preference, right?
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way, and especially when you're starting and you're just trying to figure out, what are the classes involved, what's the structure involved, and figuring out how things are contained. It makes a heck of a lot of sense to do that within Chrome. Now you've got everything figured out. You can go work from your source file and start to do some tweaks and think more about hierarchy structure and how would I use this across sites, and think more architecturally. as opposed to, how do I solve this particular problem?
Right.
So I think you're really doing, this is, for lack of a better term, this is CSS hacking with Elementor, or frankly, anything.
And I think, honestly, this is the way that I've seen probably like 9 out of 10 of the devs that I've seen on YouTube and everything. Like, this is how most people will work, because it is the kind of the most convenient way of doing it. So this is the horizontal ruler, horizontal like line that I popped in under the heading here. And it's basically, like the HTML that I injected in there. And you'll see here that it's razor thin. You can barely even see it. So we just need to apply some styling to it, right? So like what actually makes this horizontal line look the way it does is you'll see here we have the background color is transparent. If we actually just like change this to like red or something, you'll see. There you go. There you see it pop in here.
Yep.
So it's just the background color that we need to adjust, and then we need to adjust the height of this element. Like if we just change that up, you'll see the height there. So those are really the only two properties that we need to manipulate to get the line to look the way that I want. The only other thing is I just didn't want it to be that wide. So I just wanted it to cap it at like 50%, right? So that's basically all I've done it in my CSS is done it exactly that way and applied a specific color to it. So that's where this comes in here. Now, actually, I didn't do the background. I actually just left the background transparent, and I added a border top property to it instead. It's basically the same thing. I mean, there really is not any difference in the final result or whatever. Basically, the end result is you get these nice underlined headings. So that's basically. I mean, if you look at the code, it's what is that? Maybe 14 lines of code or something like that to get those things to look exactly the way you want them to. And it's really not like a lot of that CSS is not super complicated. I found when learning like CSS that positioning was one of the things that really I got tripped up on that all the time. So position absolute, position relative, these things are probably the most complicated things that you'll need to know in this particular like tutorial or whatever. But once you get the idea behind them, it's pretty easy to really work with them.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think a lot of the kind of the Elementor community would go and try and look for a widget pack that had this.
Right.
And that brings all kinds of baggage with it, including the fact that, you've got to manage it. When really 14 lines of code and a little bit of detective work and hacking around, and you've got yourself an incredible, unique CTA that you didn't have to do much for. Yeah, you had to know some CSS and you happened to use Sass, but that wasn't required. It's better workflow and better architecturally to do it this way when you start to apply it more and more places.
And if you do, I'm just going to do this very quickly, but if you know like a little bit about what you're doing here, like you can do things like you can do these little cool things that people are like, what is this, right? Like, how did you get that done? And like literally with an extra little line of code there, like I've done this like this little hover effect on these call to action buttons, right? This is this one kind of animation effect, a hover effect, but there's a whole nother hover effect. And people could be like, well, how did you do that? That's really cool. I didn't know you could do that. Well, you can't do that by default. But if you know what these little things do, like this 2 lines of code, 3 lines of code, could be something that adds this extra little touch to, your widget or your site. And really, it's one of the things that I've told everybody, kind of, I think people know about me is, like, I always like to do this one little tiny detail that like people don't see in other sites. And I like to do that with almost every site that I work on, because it's kind of like it's my Zorro, like my little my signature or whatever. And I like to do things like that. So it doesn't take a whole lot of work, especially once you get the hang of CSS and stuff. It's actually quite a bit of fun. So
yeah. No, your site's always, whenever you show something, I'm like, that's not just Elementor. Right? And that's fantastic. It really puts that kind of creative flair that speaks to who you are and allows you to be completely different.
Right, like here's another one, right? And like what I did is this is basically just some extra HTML and CSS that I added for this, and I carried over the same effect into the button hovers, so that it kind of like, it's like this signature element within this site. And it's just little things like that I find really like elevate your design, right? So yeah, I don't know. I love CSS. It's like, it's for me, it's so much, it's fun. It's just fun to do that.
Well, and like you said, you really start to develop a library of name value pairs to do these kinds of things really quickly and easily. And you start to get a handle of selectors very quickly as well. And so it's great stuff.
And it's one of the things too that I like about Sass is that like you can really start to create recyclable code that you can easily like just take out of one project and then just literally copy and paste it into another project, because like all the stuff that's in here, I mean, I kid you not, this is literally copy and pasted from the actual site that I worked on. And I just fired up this like this like starter site and pasted this code in here, and it works exactly the same way. I mean, like it's not specific to a site or how you did things. When if you set things up properly, you can easily recycle code and makes building sites out like super like a lot easier, right? So, I think your mic's off, Mike.
Sorry about that. We've taken a lot of time. I want to make sure I don't abuse your time. If you still have time to continue on, let's go for it.
Yeah,
if you want to split this out in a different day, we could do that too.
No, I think I'm good. I'll
Awesome.
try to get through the rest of this a little bit quicker.
I'll keep my mouth shut.
So let me just jump into Elementor here. So this is basically a section with 2 columns. There's not too much magic in here. It's really just a section with text in here, and I think I've just added some padding and stuff like that to make this more centered. If you look at this here, is basically an image widget, right? And it's inside of this particular column here. What I've done is, because I know in this column here, I'm going to need to do some work, some surgery. I've just added a class in here called this home. Usually the way that I structure my classes is I follow that. There's a structure that I don't remember the exact name of it, the convention, but I use like underscores to define like elements that are within another element. So this is like the home page. And then this is like an element within the home page, which is called this overlap image column.
It's called BEM or
right.
Yeah.
And
BEM,
so
for people who are interested in Googling it, BEM. It's a way of basically constructing your classes. They can make them really long, but it makes them very easy to manage if you understand what you're doing.
Right, and like when you're looking at the CSS file, like the reason why I like working with this is because just by looking at the class, you know exactly where this is located and what it's like, where in that element it's going to be, right? So like I like the way that it makes things easy to identify. So I have this class in here, and I've attached it to this column. Okay, and then I have this image here, and I think I added a class here. So overlap section image, and then I've added another class called wedding. So this is a class, the overlap section image is a class that I've used on both of these images here. And I've just used another class, wedding, to distinguish this particular image from this image here. So this image here is overlap section image, but that has an additional class of family. And I'll show you in the CSS how you can use a combination of these classes to be able to specifically choose one over the other. And basically, if we look at the way that this looks right now, in like a responsive way, let me move this out of view. Let me just go down here. Like obviously, you have these gaps in here, which is not good. But if we kind of like just start to move this in, you'll see that the images will start to scale down, and then it just creates another space below here on either side. And that's not the effect that I wanted, right? I wanted them to fill up, at the very least, what I wanted was to have this fill up the entire space. That was like the very first thing. And then the second thing is once it got big enough, like I wanted it to continue to grow and then exceed past this kind of section boundary. So basically what I did then is, if we look at the CSS here, let me just select all this. Okay, so the very first order of business is to actually like set up the classes. So you have home, overlap, section, image container. So that's the actual column here, right? And then you have inside of that the overlap section image, right? And so if we look at the code here, let me pull this back in here. Okay, so this is the overlap section image. You'll see that class right here, and it's basically the entire widget, right? But we know that Elementor adds extra like elements, right? It wraps, even like an image widget is not actually just an image. It's like a box. It's like a container that has an image inside of it. And so this is the container, and then inside of here, you'll see the image is actually here. So you have this container, then you have another class called widget container, and then you have an Elementor image, and then you have the image. Well, so if you look at the actual container, the box, you'll see that the image actually, the container actually spans the width of this area, this column. So what we need to do is just make this image be the full width of this box. So that's where in the CSS, we just said, okay, make the width 100% and let the height automatically get calculated. So you can make the height as big or as small as you need to, but just make sure that the width is always 100%. And if we gulp that, we'll see the change now is that this image is going to be full width, right? So now it's occupied the full space there. And if we just resize that, you'll see that's pretty good, even just like this, right? Like that's pretty good. The only problem though is that once you start getting this down a little bit further, you'll see that you get these spaces are still created here, because again, the image is not this tall. It's only as tall as it is here, and it doesn't know to fill that space up. That height auto is basically saying the height can be less, but the width has to be 100%. So we need a way of handling this particular scenario, right? So I'll show you how that's done. So that's the first thing there, and then so this is the next order of business here. And actually, we're going to need to do a little bit of a segue here to explain what this is here. So this is a what's called a Sass Mixin. And basically a mixin is just like a little function that you create within Sass that lets you do or recycle code, right? You can, so what this is here is a mixin that I called that is basically used to create custom breakpoints, which are also referred to as media queries. So if I just hop into, you'll see here under helpers, I have this media queries Sass file. And now you don't have to understand this. This is probably too elaborate to include here, but basically there's three functions here. There's a media query minimum, maximum, and a range. And this really covers pretty much the extent of what the kind of breakpoints that you would need to create here. The really cool thing is what you're saying is, this media query minimum function is saying, create a breakpoint that says the screen has to be at least this wide before these changes get applied, right? So usually you would use this like if you for like something like if you have on the mobile screen you have a certain styling or whatever, and then you want from like tablet up you want a different styling to be applied, you would say use this media query minimum and set this this value here to the width of your tablet screen. So this would be something like 767 pixels or something, or 768 pixels. So you would use this by saying like include media query minimum, and then you'd say 767 pixels. And then whatever style you apply in here, it would basically create a media query breakpoint that starts from 767 and up. And so this is what I use, because basically you either create three types of media queries: minimum width media query, meaning like anything from this width and higher, a media query max, meaning only all the widths up until this maximum width, or a media query range, which is like a range of sizes, like from 768 pixels to 1025 pixels. I want these changes. So that'd be like tablet, right? So those are like the three scenarios, and these three mixins here cover all of those. And so what it does is when you call this, it basically just injects this little bit of code in here with your styling into your style sheet. So like if we go back into photography here, that's what I've done here is I just said, okay, I noticed that on the screens, like from 768 pixels and up, that image can potentially get too small. So I basically said, make that image a minimum height of this exact pixel dimension and a minimum width of this exact pixel dimension. And I've also set the position as absolute. So this actually does a whole bunch of cool little things. Like if we just gulp this, and I'll show you on the front end what this kind of looks like.
So while you're taking a look at this, this is essentially, because you're using custom CSS, you're not actually participating in the Elementor breakpoints. So your custom CSS has to add essentially those three buttons, the three little tiny icons that you see next to a lot of things that are doing the same exact thing in terms of setting the ranges, minimum, maximum, and the in-between. But you had to do that in order to get the responsiveness that you needed from your custom CSS.
Yeah, and like another project that people are probably familiar of me working on is this outsourced services website, and this particular image here, to get this to work exactly the way I need to, and you guys can go in here and like load up this site and just move the screen around and just observe the way that this image works, and you'll see it moving around a bunch of times because there's probably 6 breakpoints that I used to get this to position it exactly where I want all the time, to make sure that no matter how you view this, this image is exactly where I wanted it to be. Some situations are really tricky and you need to use a lot of breakpoints to get everything to work exactly the way you want to. Other times, just a single breakpoint is more than enough. So in this particular scenario, that we're working with now, I think just that one breakpoint was really all I needed, because if we look at this here, this is basically the code here. You'll see here that the media breakpoint that got created here says media only screen and minimum width is 768 pixels. And because the resolution right now is 1686 wide, right, then this styling gets applied. So if we go to let me just bring this to, actually I can just go in here and say 768. So this is what this kind of looks like. Let me see if I can clean this up a little bit. Right, because I'm actually missing a couple of extra little bits of code in here. But actually, let me just uncomment this out so that you guys can see a little bit better what this is actually doing. Okay, so this image here, so this is the entire image wrapper, right? This is the container for that image. Because it has this position absolute, it's basically taken it out of its normal structure, the flow of the document, and we're able to basically give it a very specific height and width to it, and stretch this across the width of that section. Well, I don't know what I just did there. Let me just refresh this. Okay. Let me, where was I here? Okay. So it's probably better if why does it look so, I don't know why it looks so zoomed in. Technical difficulties.
No, I think it's your breakpoint. No, because you're over 768 now.
It's like that's what it should look. I don't know why my screen looks like it's so zoomed in.
Yeah.
Let me just try to refresh this. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so here's the container here. So it's basically just allowed me to if you look at the blue portion there, it's basically just allowed me to define these minimum widths and heights. And inside of this container, we have that image there. We still need to do some funky stuff to it because like it's still not really scaling up the way that I wanted it to. And so this is where we have these extra selectors in here. So you have one for the wedding photo and one for the family photo. So if we like undo these, just refresh that. So that should allow, and I don't know why on the for whatever reason on Chrome, whenever I do the responsiveness, it always adds this extra space here, which is never there on the actual site. I don't know why it's there when I'm in this mode, but basically what that's done here is the Elementor widget, you know, we've said that it has to be a minimum of a certain, at least a certain width and height. And so that width and height is basically like the way that I've calculated that is, if you look at this entire like row here, this row here, let me just move this over a little bit. And you can actually see in the Chrome DevTools actually gives you a little, I can't highlight it and point to it at the same time, but you'll see right above here, you have like the dimensions of the object and it says 1006.2 by 526.59. So that 526.59 is the height of this entire section. So what I did is just, you know, when you resize this and once that image gets small enough where it starts to scale down below that size, like I've just identified what that height was and I've just made the Elementor image container not be any smaller than that. So it has to be at least that height. But the minimum height and the minimum widths, they don't constrain how the image can scale. So it can still scale beyond those minimums. And so basically that allows for this little effect to happen here. So it can scale past those minimum heights and widths. And what I've done is the wedding photo here, which is the flowers, the bouquet here, is I've said, you know, align this to the bottom left. So at the bottom is set to 0 and the left is set to 0. So what that does is it basically gets this image and it says, you know, bottom left would be down on this corner here. So it basically positions this at the bottom left corner here and it anchors it to that point so that when you start to scale this like this, you know, it gets to a point where it has to be this minimum width and height that I defined. But once you know the section gets to the point where, well, actually this is part of this is where the next bit of CSS comes in, because now, you know, once it gets to a certain size here, you know, now we need to do something where we're going to be able to have it retain its dimensions at a smaller screen sizes, right? So we need some extra CSS to keep this from breaking like this, right? And so that's where this last bit of CSS comes in here. So we have this overlapped section image container. We're saying at a maximum width of 1432 pixels, we want to make the overflow hidden and we want to not have like a minimum or a maximum height. So if we go back in here and just refresh that.
Just so people know, it's really, CSS is really easy to use Google to look at these particular properties that Chris is showing. You can Google them and it'll pop up examples and everything in the first couple links. So it's actually pretty easy to learn this stuff just by taking this and Googling it as Chris is going along.
Yeah, and it's probably something that we should like clarify. Like this is a little bit like more advanced than most people are comfortable working with, because it does take like this one section here probably would have taken me, I would say, you know, a couple like 2 to 3 hours to actually, you know, get it to the point where I wanted it to. And that's somebody who already has experience with like working with CSS and manipulating things quite a bit. it's a lot of it is trial and error. You know, like I apply some styling and I see, okay, well, that's not really working out. What can I do to improve it? And so, you know, you just go in and start applying some extra stylings to see if we can help that, right? So here's an example of that. Like if we go into this here, right, these are the last two properties that we had in this breakpoint here. Is like the maximum height is none, and the overflow is hidden. So like you see here, the image kind of goes over a little bit on this side here, and that this overflow will kind of clip that off. But I think there was probably a more important reason why that was included in there. Let me just bring that back in here. So that's maximum for, yeah. So if we go back in around this side here, you know, and we look back at that tool here, you see now what that's done is basically, and some of these, I don't know why some of this stuff doesn't really play all that nice right now, but you know, basically these properties will help to keep things sort of in place within that breakpoint. I think this last little bit here is going to get taken care of in this other breakpoint that I have here, which is basically saying at a maximum of 768 pixels, I want this to have a maximum height of 450 pixels. So if I go back and refresh that, let me just do this because I don't know why it's not really refreshing it properly. Let's try doing this again. So yeah, I don't know why it's popping up like that. Like this section here is working the way that it should be.
And this is the fun of custom CSS, right? In typically you'd end up doing exactly what you're doing, which is going through, inspecting, and then figuring out, looking at what you got, looking at the structure. Why is it working here but not there? Tech differences. This is hacking it, right? And this is absolutely the way you're showing that your experience is my experience. There's always some little thing that occurs that you're like, what am I missing? What do I do? And you just have to go through at the detail level to take care of it. But
yeah, that's true. And honestly, I think part of this is just from importing it into this starter site or whatever. There could have been some extra like settings in like the Astra customizer and stuff that I would have applied that would have changed the way some of this stuff behaves. Yeah. So it is one of these things that, like, you know, you kind of have to just go in and do some detective work to figure out exactly why things aren't working the right way. But you know, this is just at a high level. Obviously, like, we don't want to get too deep into it either. I mean, we've gone pretty deep already, I think. But, but I'm sure people's heads are going to be spinning a little bit from this. But
I'm sure that people are going to be watching this 3 or 4 times, trying to figure out how in the world do I download this. But I think you've done a fantastic job. One of the other things I should say is the fact that you do have this as Sass and not as CSS, it's been minified or anything else, means that you can go back to it and look at it from a structural perspective and make sure that you don't have some type of syntax error or other things that are kind of bearing down on this particular problem. It really does help by providing the structure and capabilities with variables. Like I think I saw it was a little bit small in the text, but I think that your wedding class was actually a variable in Sass, if I remember correctly. And I didn't quite see it.
Yeah, no, it's and the classes in here are honestly probably not the greatest classes. I would say I think I rushed through this project a little bit, and I was just kind of you know, hacking a little bit when I was doing the class definitions and stuff. But like, yeah, I mean, it is one of these things where you know, you just kind of have to. I mean, and really, when it comes down to it, when you're doing a lot of like this custom CSS stuff, like Chrome DevTools is like your best friend, right? Like you know, being able to go in here and like inspect things and look at exactly, you know, what is going on. I mean, that's just something that you have to get comfortable with, right? If you don't know, like if you can't select something, you can always go into this particular like item here, and it'll actually let you laser focused selection, so you can exactly where that particular element is. And then just look at the styling that's happening in the styles section here to figure out how things are, why things are looking a certain way. And don't feel shy. Get into this particular section here and start messing with things, right? Like start adding styling, your own styling in here to see how it affects things. I mean, the best way to learn is by doing it, and really that's before actually learning CSS, like or Sass, I would say formally, when I was really digging deep into things like positioning and things like that. I really just went into the DevTools inspector, and I was just applying different styling that I thought would work. Looking up, like you said, do a lookup on Google for what transform does, right? Like, and then play around, look up what it does, how to use it, and play around with different values for it and see how it affects things, and then think about how you can use that, right? And so one of the best, if you do something like CSS transform, I think one of the sites that I like the most is like W3 Schools. It's definitely a good one. And then the CSS tricks is like a really, really good resource. So here you can see exactly how things, what types of things you can do. You can actually see code pens of like, if you go to rerun this, I don't know if it'll actually do something, but it'll actually have code pens in here with examples and everything. And this is, here, look, it tells you exactly what values you can use. So these are the kind of resources that I've used to learn CSS on my own. And then obviously to expand on that, picking up a good CSS book or a good Sass book is always going to be a good idea too. So,
yeah. Well, Chris, I wanted to say thank you. I know we didn't delve into everything, but we've sucked up a huge amount of your time, and I really, truly appreciate it. I cannot say thank you enough. I've learned, well, now I figured out how I can actually use Sass in my WordPress project. At the very beginning when you showed, just incubate it. I was like, duh. Yeah. Of course, why didn't I think of that a long time ago? But I really appreciate you taking the time. We've been able to kind of go through and look at how you can really provide flair, how you can use custom CSS outside of the quote-unquote advanced CSS box, and which has its own issues. Do something that's performance-friendly, that allows you to reuse it across sites and across projects, all sorts of great stuff. I can't say thank you enough. I'm sure the people will be raving about this all over the place. Can you tell us where we can best find you and where we can learn more from your fount of wisdom?
Well, first of all, I had fun doing this, so it's my pleasure to be here with you and share some of this stuff with other people. I think a lot of people are kind of confused about how to do this kind of stuff. Before I go on to how people can get a hold or get in contact with me, I just want to do a quick shout out to my buddy David Von Gries, who he's the developer for the WP Page Builder framework, and it's really where I got my Gulp Sas workflow from. If you go into the features of his theme, one of the things that really attracted me to it was that it was like this developer friendly thing, right? It has Gulp Sas and browser sync already built into it. And basically what it is he already has like a Gulp file set up. He already has like the folders where they need to be. And he already has that basic Sass structure already in place. So literally when you install WP Page Builder framework, you just go into the child theme and run Gulp run npm install, and it'll install all the dependencies, and you just run Gulp and it'll do the first initial Gulp to package everything up. And it already has all those tasks already predefined for you. So you actually don't need to do anything. Like this is how I started with it. I got his Gulp file and his folder structure and his workflow, and I just customized it a little bit to how I like to do things. But it's really where I got this workflow from. So I just wanted to give a shout out to him and credit and props to him for putting that together. I think it's a really good theme and really good framework. So
this keeps coming up. His theme keeps coming up as something I'm just like, man, I got to take a look at that.
Yeah. Well, he's a developer too, right? So I think he basically built this with that in mind. So that definitely did a really good job with this theme. In terms of how people can get a hold of me, obviously, Supercharger Web Agency Facebook group. If you can drop a link for people, they can connect with me there. Also, I think the main way that I like for people to connect with me is through LinkedIn. I'm actively trying hard to grow my LinkedIn network. So if you want to connect with me there, by all means, send me a connection request, and I'll definitely approve it.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Chris. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who have stuck with us through the whole rigmarole here. It's been fantastic. I frankly think that we could probably turn around and package this up and sell it as an e-course, and people would buy it. It's fantastic stuff, man. I really appreciate it. Thanks again. And thanks. Bye to everyone. And I appreciate it. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.